Welcome to the Mindful Table with Health Empowerment Coach Joanna Mickel and myself, Maame-Mensima Horne, Naturopathic Doctor and Clinical Hypnotherapist, where we discuss natural approaches to health and wellness with an emphasis on being mindful. Today's episode, we will discuss food as medicine. Food is essential for our nourishment and sustenance. And without adequate amounts of food, or if we have an excess amount of food, our health is impacted, which is why it is essential that our relationship with food as a foundation of health is explored. So this topic is really dear to both Joanna and I. As a naturopathic doctor, we do have extensive education in nutrition. And in addition to that, Joanna has a bachelor's of science in nutrition and food sciences, and she's also studying classical Chinese medicine. So she has a different perspective to add on top of that layer, which incorporates Chinese nutrition into her understanding of nutrition. So Joanna, why don't you open up the discussion and help us to understand the importance of whole foods as a means of nourishment?
Well, whole foods, we want to, of course, eating foods that are closer to where they are in nature is going to give us the most benefit. Our fruits, our vegetables, our meat sources, our grains. A lot of times we tend to go to the store and we're in the middle of the store, eating processed foods that are prepackaged. Something's been done to them, and, they remove vital nutrients and then try to put back in nutrients. And unfortunately, those reinstated nutrients are not in the form that's natural. And so whole foods is where we're going to get the best bang for our buck for our health. A lot of times, when we're choosing foods, it's kind of done, we're at the mindful table. So we're really wanting you to be mindful about the foods you choose and why, being in the moment. And a lot of times we're not. We're just choosing convenience, or we're thinking about calories as opposed to micronutrients. What are those things that really support the body for health and wellness? We are a little bit vain group of species. We like to look nice and keep our weight under control. And so calories in, calories out is what you hear all the time. And sadly, that is not what gives you weight loss and health and wellness. That can give you a roller coaster ride on the metabolic ups and downs, leading to health issues long term. And so being aware in what you're choosing, not only is it about the macronutrients, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, but it's about the micronutrients, your vitamins, your minerals, things that actually support your metabolism. Your B vitamins, your zinc, your iron, selenium, iodine. These are things that you need to make sure is in your food. Then we have phytonutrients that are found in our whole foods, which also support our body in reducing their antimicrobial, meaning they help in keeping down viruses and bacterias and fungus and so forth, because they support the immune system in fighting off these types of things that could become infectious. And so we want to make sure that those are in our diet. So when we're choosing and mindful of the foods that we're choosing, we need to understand what's in our food and how it supports our health, and knowing when to use certain foods. And so in Chinese medicine, where I'm currently working and studying, is understanding when we use these foods. What are the energetics of these foods? What's in these foods? Of course, in Western nutrition, we also learn what types of phytonutrients and micronutrients are found in our food sources, so that we can use them to support the body. Like, we want to make sure, if we're having issues with headaches and leg cramps, what types of micronutrients are very helpful at that time, such as things like magnesium, potassium, calcium. Where do we find those in our food sources? Nuts and seeds a lot of times are missed, and those are a great source of some of our micronutrients, especially magnesium. And so, these are things that can be beneficial to you, to understanding why are we choosing whole foods and how do we use whole foods for health and wellness. So kind of that's where I work with my clients, is not only saying here's your carbs, here's your fats, here's your proteins, but in these sources of foods, these are the micronutrients that are found, and these are when you should focus on these types of foods to support your body through different areas of ups and downs of health. Like, hello, we're in the cold and flu season, which I just got over the nasty flu that's going around. And so, what do I need to be eating during that time or avoiding during that time? Because both ways can be we can use it to support our health, or if we're choosing the wrong things, we can be sick for a little bit longer because we're not giving the body what it needs, or we're taxing the body. So that's why a lot of times when we're sick, we tend to go towards soups. Why? Because soups have the micronutrients in it, but doesn't tax the body in digestion. Especially the broth soups, not the ones with the milk and the dairy. Everybody likes those creamy soups, and I do too. But unfortunately, not good when you're sick. You want to go for more things that are like the whole bone broth soups, that utilizes the good nutrients in organic free range meats if you're going to make your own homemade broth, which I think is the best way because you can make it so much more tastier. So these are kind of the things to think about when you're using food as medicine, because really that is your first medicine. Hippocrates say, and I use this all the time, let your food be your medicine, let your medicine be your food. Because it's the one thing that really you're using all the time. But if we're not doing it mindfully, we're choosing things that can actually lead to inflammation, metabolic disorders, depressions. A lot of people don't realize that your food can create depressive behaviors and things that are going on. I can tell you that from my own experience. If I eat gluten, because I'm gluten sensitive, it can really cause me some dark depression. And that's usually caused because my body doesn't break it down fully. It creates an opioid type molecule that goes to the brain and blocks my opioid receptors. And then, no, I'm not happy anymore. So when I clean up, then I benefit my mood and my mental health. And so understanding even in using our food, we can actually create an environment for mental health or mental disorders. And so it's really fascinating to start taking a look at your food, what you're choosing, and how it supports your health and wellness.
No, thank you so much for that in-depth explanation. I totally agree. I share with a lot of the people I work with that they should be working the perimeter at the grocery store where the real foods are. And the more that we eat real foods, they're lower and, like you said, they're not processed, heavily processed, right? And we know that ultra processed foods actually are one of the main contributors of metabolic diseases, fatty liver disease, cholesterol increases, and things like that. So by minimizing the ultra processed foods, we're able to manage our health, manage our weight. Also, like ultra processed foods are calorie rich, but they're not nutrient rich. So you may be getting high caloric food, so you are full and you have excess energy, but you actually are not receiving the nutrients that you need on a daily basis, like the selenium, the iodine, iron, that your body needs in order to actually properly function. So I appreciate you introducing those ideas. And one of the things that I've been seeing clinically is people undernourishing themselves. So and for me, that's actually really an important aspect, because why is there is a media drive for undernourishment, and there is societal drives where, we kind of fluctuate with what the beauty norms are. But it seems like we're going back to this extreme petite physique as being the image of beauty. But in reality, being skinny or petite does not mean that you're healthy, right? And so, and the other side, you can be unhealthy at normal weight as well. So I think it's important that we remember that from the basics, our bodies have to function. And I was watching this anime and the line hit so hard. It's called Apothecary Diaries, and the main character Mao, which she said that we need food in order to live. That basically, right? And so if you're not eating, if you're not able to eat for any reason, and it was interesting because she was assessing it was a patient, she was assessing the patient's will to live by their willingness to eat, right? Because in Chinese medicine, they actually talk about this. If somebody is no longer able to eat or willing to eat, then that usually is a sign that their health is on sharp decline, and usually heading towards more terminal or chronic cases that are harder to treat. So having the willingness to eat and the ability to eat, even if you're really sick, means that you're still able to create energy, chi. And so it was really interesting because in that show, that one piece of information was like, oh my gosh, this is the subject that we're talking about later on today. And it hits because we need food, we need water. Those are two things as human beings that we cannot live without. And having the right amount of food, and you can, the right amount in balance. Our goal is to maintain balance. And what I appreciate from the Eastern framework is that a lot of disease can be categorized in deficiency and excess, right? And with food and chronic diseases, we see that. Diabetes, for example, diabetes type 2 can be categorized as a disease of excess. Back in the days, it was seen primarily in two categories, two populations, not categories, the ultra wealthy and then the very poor. So not only is it a disease of excess, it's also a disease of deficiency. And so when we look at it from that perspective, we can see how you can be deficient in the micronutrients that your body needs in order to better metabolize glucose, but you could also have way too much glucose in your body, which was seen with people who had more access to rich foods. And so, now diabetes, it really doesn't see a class or population. Like we can see it evenly distributed depending on people's, like, not just socioeconomic status, but access to wellness in general and lifestyle, because we see it even high performers, like there's adrenal driven, the cortisol, stress related diabetes factors, and then there's also the dietary. And so we're seeing it regardless, even in high performing people who may appear healthy. And it's mainly because of their stress, they're actually deficient. Some of them are not getting enough calories, their frames are petite, and yet they still have diabetes or blood sugar dysregulation. So I appreciate you bringing those ideas up because it hits on one of the main things is if we can manage our food can be a stressor, but it could also be something that is nourishing and adds value to our well-being. So I definitely appreciate that. And also thank you for introducing the idea of food being pro-inflammatory, or, food can also decrease inflammation in the body. And so it's like, in Chinese medicine and East Asian medicine, there is that balance of yin and yang. And we see that in our food, how it can drive certain things, whether it's good or bad. And it really is up to us to have that education so that we're empowered in our choices. So you do, like, as a nutrition, having a nutrition background, and your work is focused heavily on nutrition. I want to kind of dig a little deeper and talk about how the balance between macro and micronutrients, because I think that is a very important aspect of well-being and nourishment that a lot of people miss. Because, I have, depending on where a patient is located geographically, I have patients that are like, I'm healthy, I'm juicing and I'm eating smoothies, but they actually may not be getting the macronutrients that they need. And on the other side, you may have people who may be eating calorie rich, but they're not getting the micronutrients that they need. And in both populations, there are health issues that honestly are appearing. They're different, but the food is the root cause, right? Mm-hmm. Or the relationship to food. So if you could help with that understanding.
Yes, I mean, a lot of people, it's what I've seen mostly is people focusing in on macros mostly in their diet, because that's what they're the media really pushes: carbs, fats, proteins. And, and then it's, vegetables, which is great. I'm always harping on vegetables because most people don't get their vegetables. And an easy way to get your vegetables or your plants foods is to do a smoothie. and it breaks it down. But the problem is, a lot of times people don't realize how sugary your smoothies are too. And it goes in the system really, really fast. And so sometimes smoothies can actually spike sugar and people don't realize it, which can cause weight gain. But the other thing is it also attacks your digestive system from the cold. So in Chinese medicine, we're not really big on smoothies. We're good on soups, which could be similar to a smoothie, you could say. But when we do cold things, it really taxes the system. Our body is supposed to be like a furnace, and you're putting cold in the furnace. But in that, yes, you have a lot of micros, but you're missing some of the micros. And so a lot of times when you're doing a really low calorie diet and utilizing smoothies, that some people use protein powders, but it's not all of the protein. Yes, we can use collagen proteins, we can use pea proteins and different things like that. It's still not quite in its natural state. It's been processed too. Okay, so we want to have proteins that are of their natural source, not a powder so much. And so we end up not getting good proteins to support the body to build. And so that's why we're not getting enough macros when we're doing things like juicing. And I'm not a big fan of juicing because, again, when you're juicing, you're getting rid of the fiber. You're getting rid of the roughage. So I like smoothies better if you're going to do one versus the other because you're going to still have the roughage. So,
and what's the benefit of the fiber, just so people understand the difference of having the fiber?
Yeah, so having the fiber helps in stool formation, but it also helps in supporting a healthy gut microbiome. That's their sustenance, is the fiber. So fiber, and it also slows down in some. So if you're juicing, you're even faster in getting the sugars from, if you're putting fruits and things in there, you're going to be even faster getting the sugar than if you have the whole food and doing this smoothie, which keeps the fiber in there, which will slow it down somewhat, but because it's already ground up, the body doesn't have to break it down, which means that's why you're getting the sugar faster in a smoothie, which spikes your insulin. So depending on what you're putting in your smoothie. So that's kind of another thing there. So one of the things I like is to make sure people are getting, if you're going to be doing a diet and focusing on calories, is making sure you're getting your basal metabolic rate of calories. A lot of times people are only doing 1,000 to 1,200. Your body has to sustain its lean body mass. And that lean body mass is sustained through what's known as the basal metabolic rate. And most people's basal metabolic rate is over 1,200 calories. So if you're eating less than 1,200 calories, your body doesn't go after fat. It goes after the tissue that burns calories because you're telling it, I don't have enough to sustain you. And so therefore, I'm going to get rid of you. And so it creates an actual cortisol response, which goes after your lean body mass. And so a lot of people that's been doing the yo-yo dieting where they're dropping below 1,200 calories or down to 1,200 calories causes your thyroid to slow down and you get fatigued. And so when I work with clients, we go to the basal metabolic rate. That means you're burning that without doing anything else. So you're always going to be in a calorie deficit eating your BMR, which is your basal metabolic rate, because you're going to be doing more things throughout the day. And then we increase that even more from exercise. So you can, when we're doing that, the body can maintain the lean body mass and go after fat. So that's kind of one of the things that I tell people is you do not go below your basal metabolic rate because you're starving your lean body mass. And then when we start saying, okay, so now we understand our macronutrient or our caloric nutrients. Now in the caloric nutrients, we need to understand the macro splits because that's another kind of broad category, but we understand what do we need carbs for, what do we need proteins for, and what do we need fats for. Because each of them have different functions within the body and we need to have a certain amount to support it. So usually, I always kind of have a base at 20% of my calories with proteins. Usually the FDA and all them say 10 to 15%. I don't believe that's quite enough in my take and my look, especially if we're going to be doing exercising and trying to build lean body mass. And if we're sick and inflamed, we need more protein to support the body. So usually right now when you're coming in and working with me or working with a naturopath or somebody that has nutrition background, we understand the need for protein and most people is going to be higher because we're coming in an inflamed state. So we want to have the support there. Then we look at the carbs and fats, and that depends on the individual, their activity level, what type of activity they're doing, If they're stressed out, all these things, it's going to say how much do we lean towards carbs, because carbs in that sense are going to go more when we're highly stressed, doing high activity, we're moving a lot, and things like that. Or if we're studying, that means carbs, because carbs are more geared, your body uses that more so than fats in those instances. Now, if we go overboard in carbohydrates, that can lead us to type 2 diabetes, because our body is very stringent on how many carbs it needs, because carbs, when it's elevated in the system, is inflammatory. So we have to be very cautious on our carbs because we don't want to cause the inflammatory response. It's easy to get carbs in because it's easy to go grab a sandwich or to do, again, smoothies. Things that are easy tend to be more carb driven. So we have to be very cautious with that. And then with our fats is if we're doing kind of low impact stuff, we're sedentary most of the day, or O blood type individuals, their metabolism tends to run more towards the fats. So we have to be very careful in those types of individuals too. That's a whole nother gamut. But understanding your metabolism also is one of the things that we have to do. And so once we understand that mix, then we have to look at our macros, right? So when we got enough of our, calories, we've got them mixed with the macros. Now we have to make sure we have the micros. And that's where I say, look at the rainbow. Mm-hmm. Rainbow colors, because colors really dictate a lot of times what types of micronutrients are in them. Like red, orange, and yellow is going to have your vitamin A more often. If you have your green leafies, which of course vitamin C can be across all the spectrums, vitamin C and vitamin K and vitamin E tend to be a lot more in our green vegetables. And then of course our fruits can have the mix of those as well, more towards our vitamin C, and water-soluble vitamins are going to be found there, as well as in our meats. We also find most of our B-complex vitamins are found in our meat sources and some of our grains, and then our minerals are going to be found, of course, in our plants foods, our meat foods, and then our nuts and seeds. Especially, nuts and seeds are a really good source of magnesium, which we don't get a lot, and people don't sleep very well, and magnesium is a great way for sleep. So, getting those nuts and seeds scattered throughout our week is a really good idea too. And so being able to make the rainbow on our plate or across our plates for the day is going to help us get those micronutrients and know what our macros are in our choices as well. So that's kind of how I work and see how we need to balance our diet so we're not under consuming our micronutrients and over consuming in our macronutrients, to where we have that balance. And that gives us health and wellness, right? In those mindful choices we make.
No, thank you definitely for sharing that. And, some of the things that you mentioned that I agree, 100% agree with, especially when you were talking about being under the basal metabolic rate and our body's attacking the tissues. I see this in a lot of autoimmune conditions in general, where the body is attacking itself, right? And also inflammatory diseases, because one of the things that we're taught is that our bodies are very efficient. And if it needs something and it has access to it, it will break down whatever is there in order to get what it needs. So what that could be like is, hey, we need some fats for something. Let us go and break down whatever this is in this tissue. And I mean, I'm curious, like also with proteins and cartilage, and we see high rates of inflammation and arthritis, right? The arthritis that we see. I've always, like, one of my questions before school was, is there a relationship between arthritis and micronutrients or macronutrients that our body's like, hey, I need this, let me go to the joint. I grew up eating meat and, enjoying the cartilage of animals. And so I know that the more that I give my body aspects of what it needs, what it has, I have less pain in my body overall. And so, I know that supports the theory that exists that, if you give your body what it needs, it will minimize the destruction of the structures that we depend on. And I think it's important that we remember that if we're always in deficit, that means, or if we're too much in a deficit, where's your body going to get what it needs from? Is going to start breaking down itself. And I know a lot of influencers and health people talk about the catabolic state and how essential it is. But I have seen that long-term chronic catabolic reactions in our body is more destructive over time than it is productive for longevity and health, because your body needs to also do anabolic reactions. It needs to build just as much as it breaks down. So that was one of the things that I really appreciate that added foundation on. And then also kind of helps to go into inflammation as a general topic, because our diets are a major source of inflammation. And a lot of people are chronically inflamed. And you talked about sugar as a way, as a means. Yes, sugar is very inflammatory. And conditions like frozen shoulder are connected to high blood sugar states because sugar is sticky. And when it sticks to blood cells, it actually can adhere, it creates adhesions. And then you have mobility issues because you have these things that should be not sticking together. And say you have an injury and you have excess stickiness in your bloodstream. Now you have these mobility and painful issues where you have frozen shoulder or other things. I think I shared like when I had like this Italian soda here in Korea, and I immediately could feel like my blood vessels, like my fingers started to get cold. And I've been warm for so long, and that was just like, oh my gosh, like let me like stay away from this because I am cold and it's gonna be winter. So, obviously now I just do my soda water, of course, if I want something fizzy. But having those awarenesses, and also high sugar. So a lot of people have acid reflux, or they have like coughing that is not associated with an infection. And a lot of that can also happen after eating too much sugar. And so I mean, there's so many things, and it's not like I've said this before, I'm not against sugar. It's just, again, when we have too much of something, it creates disorder. And so having the right balance is essential for our health. And I think that is really what this food is medicine is, because, there are so many options out there. There's medications that people are using in order to lose weight, but for long-term maintenance, the medications, if you stop the medication, there's always rebound. And why is there a rebound? There's a rebound because the real issue is not being addressed. And so this is really how we relate to food is really how we address and encourage the weight management that we desire. And that's through movement and our diet, right? That really helps. And, you were talking about ways that we can get magnesium. One of my favorite ways is bone broth, right? Because with bone broth, you're able to break down some of the minerals that are in the bone, magnesium, calcium, all of them, iron, a lot of the minerals in the bones, in the bone marrow are easily, they're more bioavailable. They're easier for our bodies to access them. And we were able to utilize them appropriately. And I also liked before you talked about food as a contribution to mental health. I feel like that for me is one of a major aspects of the work that I do, because when people think about it's a chemical imbalance, where are those chemicals in our brains coming from? A lot of the neurotransmitters are proteins, right? They're derived from proteins. We have neuropeptides, peptides being amino acids, little protein babies, right? So the precursors to making the proteins. So the reality is having the right balance of protein and making sure that we're getting adequate amounts of protein is essential for protecting our mental emotional health. And it's like, why do people get sleepy after they eat turkey? Turkey is rich in tryptophan. What does tryptophan help to create? Serotonin, melatonin. And so if we have enough tryptophan, maybe, just maybe over time, like people, like, so in mental health, one of the major drugs are SSRIs, serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And it's stopping the serotonin from being absorbed back into the cell. But the other question, which was posed by, like, I read this, a naturopathic doctor who specializes in mental health, she brought this topic up into my awareness. What if it's because we're not getting enough tryptophan? What if the tryptophan is missing from the diet? So are we able to actually help produce serotonin by helping to guide the body to making those amino acids because our body needs them? And the same thing goes with fats, right? We learn in nutrition courses that it's fats, yes, you can have fats that are inflammatory, but we also have anti-inflammatory fats like our omega-3s. But even meats, which we're like, "Oh, beef is so bad for you, it's so pro-inflammatory." But grass-fed meat, we know, has a higher omega-3 omega-6 ratio. So we actually know that if our food is inflamed, giving our animals highly inflamed foods like a high corn diet and not grass-fed, we see how that contributes to the imbalance of inflammation and anti-inflammatory macro and micronutrients in the body. So, when we talk about food as medicine, this topic alone is very vast because there are so many things that contribute, including food production and the promotion, as we talked about, highly processed foods as a norm, where those of us who eat closer to nature, even if we're eating in excess, our weight is managed because we're not indulging excessively into foods that are rich again in calories, but really are not providing nutrients and sustenance for us to properly burn the calories. And lastly, when you talked about the high glucose, how sugar, carbs are easily accessible. When carbs are stored, initially they get stored to be utilized quickly. But if we have excess carbs, they get converted into fat. And so if you have dietary fats, this is my understanding from what I've studied, dietary fats we can use, and that's great energy if we have lower carbs. But if we have a high carbohydrate diet, the dietary fats may still be utilized for energy, and then the carbohydrates actually are what's primarily getting transformed and stored in the tissue, the fat tissue, the adipose tissue. A lot of it comes from excess carbohydrates. So this is why that, back in the day, it was the majority of the plate was it was 6 to 11 servings of carbohydrates a day. And, I try and keep people, my happy number is about 100 grams. But, it can go a little bit higher, but I feel like managing our carbohydrates, because if you eat plant-based foods, you're going to get your carbohydrate intake and you can add to that. But having a lot of pastas, rice, breads, that's where we run the risk of actually creating more increases in adipose tissue. So having that understanding, I think, is important, because a lot of us don't understand the balance and the ratios that we were taught back in the days are not necessarily beneficial to our overall health and well-being. So yeah, thank you so much. You gave a lot.
Yeah, when you're talking about that, one thing I like to explain to my clients is, how does the body digest? When you understand how the body digests, how it utilizes, and where things go, and what's a first pass. So we have two ways that our nutrients are absorbed in our body: one through the lymphatic system, and one through the circulatory, or the blood circulation system. And they go in two different directions. And when you understand this, you can understand why we have to watch certain ways we do our nutrients. So the lymphatic system absorbs fat, and it bypasses our customs broker, I call it, which is the liver. So fats actually go into direct bloodstream and gets used first because it goes to the heart. And so it goes to the heart. Why does it go to the heart first? Because the heart likes fats for nutrients. And they talk about cholesterol is causing heart disease and blah, blah, blah. Well, it's not from the fat in your diet, because that's what it wants first and foremost. Why? Because fat is what it utilizes. That's why also oxygen goes to the heart first, because the heart has to have oxygen to burn fat, because it's high energy dense. The heart never gets a break. So it has to have energy source and oxygen source to keep itself going. It cannot get fatigued. So that's why it's a first pass, goes to the heart first. Now, second, going through the bloodstream, that's where it has to go for the liver to look at it. And the liver, why does the liver have to go with the blood? Because it has to look at things that could be detrimental to the health. And sugar is it. So sugar actually goes to the liver first. And the liver then determines, do I need to store you? Which it does. It's going to store glycogen first, because it has to make sure it has a certain amount that the blood needs. So the liver stores sugar for blood, because the blood can't use oxygen. And so it has to use sugar. And it has to have an availability of sugar at all times, because it can't not have sugar. It will cause you to have problems, because if it doesn't have energy, it can't transport oxygen. And then we have a problem. So the liver takes in how much it needs to store for the blood, and then it says, okay, now do we have too much going into the blood? Because, of course, we can only have about a teaspoon of blood, sugar in the blood, which is not very much, guys. And if we're over consuming that, the liver has to do something in it. So you mentioned before what's known as fatty liver disease, right? And back in the day, fatty liver disease, because we were more in balance with our sugars and our fats in our diet, most of our fatty liver came from alcohol, because alcohol gets broken down into sugar, but it also bypasses some of the regulatory systems where the body doesn't know what to do with it after it's processed it. So it just stays in the liver. The liver's like, what do I do with this excess stuff? I'll just make fat and sit there. Same thing happens when we overconsume high fructose corn syrup, which is a sugar substitute molecule found in a lot of our processed foods. Well, now, more often than not, we have what's known as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, because all that sugar and substitute sugars and processed sugars go into the liver, and the liver's got all this stuff it's got to deal with and know, what am I supposed to do? And it doesn't, and it just builds up in the liver. And so that's where we have the issue with sugar and overconsumption of sugar, is the liver gets bogged down with, what am I supposed to do with this? And if it can't handle it, guess what? It bypasses the liver. And now we have all the sugar in our system doing what you mentioned, creating the sticky environment. And what sugar does, if you've heard of A1C, most of our listeners is probably when you go in and you get your physical every year, if your blood glucose level is high, they'll check your A1C stands for glycosylated hemoglobins, HbA1c, hemoglobin glycosylation. So it's really sugar sitting on the outside of the blood cell. The blood has said, I've got all I need inside. Well, it's like, well, I got to take a ride, because I'm going to have to do something. And it sticks to the blood markers on the outside of the cell. And now it becomes rigid and sticky, just like if you have crystals, you get sugar on your hand, it gets kind of crystalline, you're like, ew. Well, that's what happens to your blood, and that's why it begins to start clumping. And then not only is it sticking to your blood cell, if it can stick to your blood cell, it can stick to the outside of your, what's known as your epithelial, or the lining of your vessels and other things, creating an immune response, because now the body doesn't recognize it, because a lot of these are known as identification molecules to the body. And we talk about autoimmune conditions, just inflammatory conditions. When the body can't recognize itself anymore, it attacks it or creates an inflammatory response. And that's what leads us to neuropathies, retinopathies, and basically you can't get blood to your fingers, because it's clogged up your small vessels as well. And then of course it gets into the joints. I have had many of my clients talk about when they remove a lot of their sugar and get their carbohydrates down and the processed sugars down, that their hands, I had one individual talk about that she couldn't even grip a doorknob because her hands hurt so much. I had a gentleman talk about he would come in and say, my hands are so stiff and stuff, and then I realized I had been drinking like you said, sugary stuff. And my
Yeah.
hands, I can feel it in my hands now. They don't want to move, So sugar a lot of times does attribute to the arthritises. Now, there's other types of inflammatory molecules that also go through. Your proteins go through the liver too. Why does the proteins go through the liver? Well, your proteins are actually, a lot of your proteins are manufactured in the liver, so they need the
Yeah.
proteins. They're also water soluble. Well, we have things known as lectins. And lectins, excuse me, are known as sugar binding proteins. And a lot of our markers on our cells are also sugar too, different forms of sugars. And so they'll stick to it, also doing the same clumping effect that sugars do. So both proteins and carbohydrates have to be monitored more so than the fats. So fats have been the guys that's always getting the bad clout, and it's not so much those guys. Now, there are things in fats that are inflammatory. That's another thing I'm going to get to here in a minute. But when we look at the things that clump up, they cause the inflammation. So we have to watch it, because our poor little liver, he gets all kinds of bad stuff in there. You always hear about liver detoxes, right? Why is that? We got to get the sludge out. Well, in fats, why are fats a problem? You were talking about the meat sources causing inflammation because they're inflamed. Well, the fat is usually what they go after, saying it's very fatty and stuff. Fat molecules are storage molecules as well, right? We're storing sugars now made into fat. Proteins, if we do in excess, becomes fat. But they also store our fat-soluble vitamins and fat-soluble phytonutrients and things like that, which is
And
great. We need
toxins.
this. That's and our vitamin D. So all this is stored in our fat, which is great. So when we eat a grass-fed, free-range meat source, we're getting all those fat-stored nutrients. But they also can store pharmaceuticals, toxins from the environment, other types of things in the fat cell. That's why, when a doctor prescribes medications, they have to look at your body composition. And when you lose weight, in my undergrad in food science, it was a precursor to dietetics. We were also taught that when you go to lose weight, we have to support inflammatory responses and slow the process, because if they've been on medications, we can cause a medication overdose because they're stored in the fat. So not only is our fat, can have these things in it, the animal sources can too. And so we have to be aware of these things when we're choosing our food, so we're not getting those types of toxins. We want the good things stored in the fat, not the bad things stored in the fat. And so that's the problem with that is, again, fats bypass the liver. So they're going to go through, and those toxins are going to get into our system faster from the fats than, say, from the proteins and the carbohydrates. And so that's where the fats can be a danger zone and cause inflammation, is the things that are stored in them that ride along with them. We want the good things, the vitamins and the minerals, not the bad things that go along. So when we understand those kind of concepts, then we can say, oh, this is why we choose those foods. I know I went into some in-depth
No,
stuff there.
it's a lot, and it's also very important because you're right. We talk a lot about the importance of maintaining our weight. We talk a lot about the balance of macros and how calories impact and all the things. We're talking about disease, chronic diseases like cancers. We're talking about diabetes. We're talking about high cholesterol. There's so many things that are talked about, and I feel like people are overwhelmed. When I work with my patients, I know that they do get overwhelmed with the information, because there's information overload from outside sources, and to meet one-on-one and discuss how to address some of the information that may not necessarily be supporting their health, that can also be overwhelming as well. So this is the reality of like today. It's like there's so much information and it is a lot. And, one of the things that's really important to me is coming to a place where it's like, we don't have to be perfect about all of these things. We can still enjoy our life. We can still enjoy food, and we can maintain a healthy balance. Because yes, like we know that, like you were talking about, we're talking about how excess sugar kind of creates these agglutinations, and then you have inflammation, or like really our blood vessels in our fingers and our toes are smaller than the blood vessels closer to our trunk. And so the smaller vessels tend to be impacted by sugar molecules more. That's why you do notice inflammation people have in their hands, in their extremities, their hands and their feet and their legs, because the vessels get smaller and smaller and smaller the further away that we are from the heart. And then also how it impacts the brain, because, if it's fat soluble, or if there's damage to the blood-brain barrier, you have these molecules traveling to the brain, and the sticky plaques go there. And that's why things like that, Alzheimer's is considered like the diabetes type 3, where high blood sugars, histories of high blood sugars plays a part. One part of it, I also believe that, as you're saying, like especially with like weight loss, and depending on what is stored in our fat cells, as that, because if it's fat soluble, it can go through some of the lipid bilayers and some of the barriers that we have that are not water soluble, that especially for that allow non-water soluble molecules to bypass into those areas. So I think it's important that we have these conversations, because people do need to understand a little bit more about how our relation to food can be a support system, but it also can be part of the disease pathways that we are working with our patients and clients to help them improve. And, in talking about these systems, one of the things that we really didn't touch on is how foods, our bodies, when they are inflamed, are sensitive. You did touch on the overreaction, right? And we see that in allergies, but we also have antibody reactions and then delayed sensitivity reactions. So, the allergy is IgE, which is an antibody reaction, but we also have other antibodies, IgG. A lot of the food sensitivities tend to be mediated by IgG. We also have IgA reactions as well. And these are not the same. Like, we usually see immediate reactions to food. So if somebody is allergic to cheese or milk, they're going to react immediately if it's an IgE reaction. But if you have an IgG, IgA, or even the delayed sensitivity type 4 delayed sensitivity reactions, you may have T cell activation, right? So these are our immune cells that are there to help support us and fight the immune system that really keeps us strong. But when they start attacking foods or our self, the self, because they can't recognize the self, then we end up having these reactions that really are an indication that our immune system is overreactive to some triggers. And a lot of it, once we address the food sensitivities, what I have seen historically is that the overreaction, the inflammatory reactions tend to calm down significantly, and the reactions may shift. Yeah, so that's something that is really, I think, important, especially right now where we're seeing people who are having reactions to food. Here, a lot of the foreigners, I've met only a few Koreans. Like, I talk to other doctors and I'm like, hey, do you know about celiac? A lot of people don't realize here that people have a reaction to wheat. Wheat isn't a lot of things. And there are a lot of foreigners who move here actually come with celiac disease or a gluten intolerance. And so, and engaging with people who are here, and also being gluten sensitive myself, like they're not allergic reactions for some of us. Like, celiac disease is actually a T cell activated, often delayed sensitivity reaction, but it's due to the immune system being overwhelmed and triggered, and then the body is really attacking itself. Micronutrients are not even being able to be absorbed. And I know for some people, it looks like deficiency, iron deficiency, it can be B12 deficiency. There's so many other minerals that become deficient, and it's not due to a lack of ingestion, it's just the body is no longer able to absorb what is available. And so when it comes to those kind of conditions, that's where, we're able to help, especially like as a naturopathic doctor, being able to help people to heal utilizing more higher force interventions outside of nutrition, but we still build the foundation with the nutrition in order to bring the body back in balance, right? So, I think those are things that they are important that we're talking about so that we're helping people who do have like autoimmune conditions to have a better understanding that there are ways that we can utilize food as well to build that foundation so that their immune system can work better and we can work towards healing some of the autoimmune conditions or improving or decreasing the advancement of the condition, which is what I enjoy helping people with because, through this medicine, that's one of the things that I was able to experience myself personally.
Same here. That's kind of what brought me to nutrition and naturopathic medicine and Chinese medicine is my journey to health and wellness, and learning about the blood type diet, which is one that actually kind of shows you a little bit of the inflammatory responses of food based upon the individual. And blood being one of the ways to determine somebody's susceptibility or sensitivities to foods based on it. Does the food interact with their blood markers? Do they create enough of the digestive enzymes to be able to break down the food so it doesn't and interact with other molecules in the system? So like celiac disease, gluten, like I said, I spoke a little bit earlier about lectins. Well, gluten is a lectin, but it's a lectin that's actually produced from the processing of wheat. So the more processed the wheat is, the higher amounts of gluten is formed. It's actually formed through two proteins found in your wheat product. So overseas, a lot of people that have gluten sensitive have less response because the gluten isn't formed as much in their wheat products. So I've heard Italian wheat is probably the best that individuals have worked with that have had gluten sensitivity. They can actually eat bread from that type of wheat with a lesser response. Now, I haven't been able to buy me any Italian flour so I could see if this is true because I love my bread. Unfortunately, I have to avoid it because of that. But, so what happens is a lot of times you talked about IgAs, IgGs, and IgEs, which are antibodies with different immune responses in the body. And a lot of times our allergies are actually a progression of these three molecules from going from a low inflammatory response, which is your IgA. IgA is the mediator between what's known as the innate immune system and the adaptive. It's the first century, so it's a little bit more non-specific. And so a lot of times people bypass IgA because they're like, I can deal with the phlegmy throat, the coughing, the little bit of acid reflux, the little bit of bloating or the crampy stomach, and the diarrhea or the constipation. These are all IgA responses a lot of times in the digestive system, the mucus of the runny nose and things like that, which we usually get when we interact with dust molecules and things like that when we first are, dealing with new environments, things like that. Those are IgA responses, and we tend to just ignore them and continue eating the foods that are creating these responses. Unfortunately, the more you bypass IgA, the body gets more damaged because now it's going past those centuries and they move into the bloodstream or into the tissue. So bloodstream centuries are your IgGs. So those are sensitivities. They're not going to cause a humongous I've been invaded kind of response, which is your IgEs we're going to get to in a moment. And so then we start creating what's called subacute inflammation. So we had like minor inflammation with IgAs. Now we have subacute, and that's going to be the joints that hurt, the fatigued muscles, the brain fog, depression, right? The low energy because our metabolism it's sluggish now because there's inflammation everywhere and the body's trying to survive. And so everything is kind of subacute. You're like, I don't really feel well, and I'm starting to, really notice something. Well, if we go past it and we continue to eat, and we're continuing to make these IgG responses, that leads to autoimmune conditions because now the immune system is just so overly inflamed. Then it starts causing tissue damage. And a lot of times now, IgGs can be created from really extreme, bypassing of our immune responses. But then we create the IgE responses. And that's why a lot of people over time create allergies, which causes anaphylactic responses. And then you don't eat those foods ever again because you don't know if you're ever going to get yourself back out of that. Some people
But
have
sometimes you're born with those.
Right. And that's because something maybe in utero or, whatever that might be, created that IgE response. Anyway, so, if you've been kind of in an inflamed state for really long, so you can create, because I've seen people end up getting shellfish allergies, peanut allergies, and so on, from just being so inflamed so much that the system now can't use its first two. But I've also seen it reversed because we took away those foods and things and allowed the body to clean it up. And then when we started noticing, and so sometimes those IgG sensitivities can actually go away because we've cleaned up and created the barrier back again. And we've allowed the body to properly process foods appropriately to where we don't have those immune responses. But we have to know who was our original trigger that created the whole downline cascade. And so a lot of nutritionists and naturopaths utilizes protocols such as and functional practitioners, an elimination diet, a gut repair and reestablishment, and then reintroduction of food so they can find their true food sensitivities that start with the IgA response. Because when we start there, we prevent the downstream and we can get rid of some of those sensitivities. Now again, the things that we know are, you could say, universally inflammatory, such as your processed foods, such as your overproduction of toxins. So you have your, what is it called? Your glyphosates, inflammatory herbicides and pesticides, of course, are going to be that way. Too much sugar can be a problem, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we learn to use to say, let's eliminate those, and then what do we do to, protect our body by having the whole rainbow in our diet, and eating the whole foods, eating those grass-fed free-range meats, then we can help in reducing the inflammatory responses from IgGs, IgAs, IgEs, and keeping those down and feeling better. And I know when I did that for myself, I did the elimination, I started recognizing my inflammatory foods. Of course, I'm not 100%, I do an 80-20, because I like having bread every now and then. But I know that it takes 4 days to clean it up. So don't, people don't realize it takes 4 days for the body to run through inflammatory things. That's why a lot of times it takes 4 days when you get sick. If everything's running a little bit, you tend to kind of go into a peak and then it cleans out. And so I usually say, watch. If you eat something bad, you'll have symptoms for 4 days as it's cleaning it up. That's inflammation, feeling bad. And then you start feeling better after that 4th day and the body's cleaned it up. But if we keep adding those inflammatory things every day, well, it's 4 days, 4 days, 4 days, and you're never getting to the resolution. It builds
up to a cascade. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the thing that's important to recognize is sometimes we don't know because we're eating so many things. It's hard to identify what is actually creating these reactions, which is why I think it's important that people work with a practitioner so that they're able to get the support. Because yes, we do elimination style work, but we're also supporting you in different ways so that we can help do the cleanup more efficiently and then the repair. Because we're talking about inflammation and damage and chronic damage, and a lot of the damage is done over time, and we need to create. So what I love about like herbs and food is that we have properties that are naturally found in nature that we can utilize to support healing. And if you know how to use them, you know how to match them well, then you're able to create the right, like I would say, medicine for the patient, or for the patient, so that they're able to heal what is happening. And so what I found is, the elimination is one step, but it's not until we actually do the repair and restore work that we were able to do the greater good. And, one of the last things I wanted to touch on, in the work that I do with heart-centered hypnotherapy, one of the major topics that we focus on is called the nourishment barrier. And the nourishment barrier is really looking at how trauma and like early life adverse events can impact our ability to accept healthy nourishment. So having those healthy relationships with food, but taking it outside of just food, like how do we nourish ourselves even outside of food? So our relationships, the media that we expose ourselves to. And also because of that same nourishment, there's sometimes we find that people are unconsciously attracted to things that are not good for them, like the toxic foods, toxic people, work environments that are not healthy. And so this relationship I see a lot with we could see it early with the relationship with food. And so when I'm working with people in regards to weight management, utilizing the programs that I offer, this is one of the topics that we really look at exploring because it goes back to how we see our food and our relationship, not just to our food, but to our environment and our emotional state and the traumas that with the big traumas, the little traumas that we experience and how that plays a part in how we engage with our relationship to food and our environment. And so, as we're coming to the end of our episode, looking at how we do have our relationship to our food, but also our stressors, our lived experiences, our early experiences, and the emotional relationships that we have in our environment and with ourselves, this also plays a major part in how we're able to maintain that balance. And I think it's also like it plays a part in our ability to have that 80-20 relationship where, some of us, we talked about it in the past, issues of orthorexia, so having a strong need to be healthy, micromanaging, and having that perfectionist mentality to our relationship with food and our nourishment. That is an extreme that some aspects of perfectionism, people are like, oh no, this is good for us. But in reality, that also is not necessarily healthy in our ability to nourish. It goes back to, it's how we may undernourish ourselves, not getting all of our needs met because of our need to be, whether it's healthy looking or whatever it is, and I know that when it comes to the relationship with food is one of the most complicated relationships that I believe that we have in our lives, because there's an aspect of our history, our culture, our family relationships, all of these things play a part. There's a nostalgia that plays a part. And then there's also, our desire to be well. And sometimes, like I said, that unconscious layer that may not want to be as well. So we eat unconsciously, grabbing what is available to us, not really being mindful and aware of how our what we're eating and bringing into our bodies actually has an impact on us. And so that mind-body connection is a critical aspect of our relationship, and as food being our medicine, because our mental, emotion, and our physical bodies, they're all intertwined. And, food is like essential for life. And so because it's essential for life, how we deal with life, a lot of times food comes to play at that. And I'll share it. So like, I'm taking language classes, I'm learning Korean. And in my class, we talked about how the question is, how do we handle stress? So stress of like when we receive stress, it's the literal translation. What do we do? We're asked this actually on Friday. And a lot of my classmates were talking about their relationship to food and alcohol, calling their friends, going out for drinks. And the question is, do you drink by yourself? Are you like, when you're stressed, are you going for that food and all of these things? And our relationship to stress is directly played into how we relate, the things that we do, our behaviors. So if we're able to have better relationship with our behaviors, then we're able to have a better relationship with the food.
I liked what I was reading you're speaking about that. I'm reading how to start or a guide to starting a business because I'm trying to
Mm-hmm.
get, really get my business rolling. So I'm going back and kind of getting some tips. But the gentleman in the book talked about mindfulness. He says for success, you need to be a mindful person. And he really made it, because I've read about mindfulness in other ways, and his take really, I think, illuminated it a lot more clearly for me what mindfulness can be. And in the mindfulness, he was talking about every action you make. When you make that action or you make that choice, you are in that moment, not looking at and kind of looking at it in relation to where you want to go. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
times we're not, when we go to choose our food, we do it based on history, right? Not on where we want to go. And we're not usually in the moment a lot of times because I think a lot of times we just, it becomes too common, you might say. And so when we go to choose foods, it's going to be sometimes based upon our emotion for that day. You've heard the Southern comfort foods, and Southern
Soul
comfort
food.
food, soul food, right? They're not usually the most healthy of foods, but they taste really
They
good.
can be.
They can be, yes, you can make them
Yeah,
a
you
lot of times,
can,
but
if you're mindful and intentional in
yeah,
your choices, you
right.
can take something and make
Yeah,
it comforting and
yeah.
adapt something that may not be as healthy into something that is more
Right. And
nourishing.
that's what I work with my clients. But a lot of times, and another thing, I've seen it in some of my family members too, is how you were raised. We've talked about this in the past about food deserts and what's available and affordability. And a lot of times, people that are low income, they're going after like Hamburger Helper and
Mhm.
SpaghettiOs and all that stuff that's in the middle of the store that's, highly processed and cheap. And unfortunately, that has become, like you said, their relationship with it has to do with their memory. And then sometimes having it was at a happy time, and so they want to recreate the happy time. And so it's subconsciously done in times of stress where they go after these foods that aren't necessarily healthy and beneficial to their health. And so when we think about mindfulness and teaching individuals that when you're making a choice, mindfulness is about being in the present moment and thinking about what your beliefs are, what is it that your goals are, what is it that you're looking to do or become, and making those choices with an open, clear mind. And rather than the subconscious that's based upon our emotions, based upon our history, based upon, our past and our past relationships, because that's going to make us who we were in the past. It's not going to make us who we're going to be. And so I really kind of liked his idea of making, it kind of made me think, wow, every time you go to do something, and I get, it's kind of the same idea with meditation and mindfulness, is to bring yourself to the moment and being aware of that moment and what it does for the next moment. And creating, we've talked about this too before about how our beliefs create our behaviors, which create our habits and so forth, which creates our character and who we are meant to be. And so a lot of times, just life and stress, like you spoke of, stress takes us out of that forebrain and the mindfulness piece. And so I like that we work in that realm more so. Yes, we're talking about food as medicine, but we have to get to that root piece, which is, like you said, the belief systems, the things in the mind that creates the body, or vice versa, both working hand in hand. Because once we make that knowledge known to individuals and we work with them, and that's why it's so important for, I talk to my clients about this, and he even speaks about it, is our perception of failure. I loved that other piece in his book too, because he says, know when you're going into a business and really just in life, you're always going to be, you're always going to have a time of failure. But failure is a time for a stepping stone to success when you self reflect or become mindful. And I like that because he made it so much. He says when people make failure an end point, then you never go on. But if you make failure a stepping stone to your success by saying, well, that wasn't the way to do it. Some people say that, Thomas Edison's, failed like 900 times before he got the light bulb. And you're like, aren't you upset about this? No, I just found 998 ways not to do a light bulb. And so I tried again. And that's the same thing as we have people coming, they're trying to eat right, but they're not getting the knowledge or the stepping stones from those failures. And that's why working with a practitioner, a naturopath, or a coach can help them. I tell them, when you fall, when you don't meet that goal, come to me, don't stay away, because he said no success is done in an isolation. You have to have a network. You have to have people there to help you.
Yeah.
And so how do you get to understand how to use food as medicine? Now, most of what we talked about today was food as poison, really, right?
No,
We
we
hadn't
talked
made it.
about, we
We
had the
did talk about
balance
how it
of
can
it. We
be
did talk about the
medicine.
balance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I'd like to get a little bit more in depth into the food as medicine piece, but we have to make a foundation to understand why is food can be our medicine. But anyway, it's really helping us to be able to make people mindful. So when you fail or you fall or you feel like I didn't meet the goals, don't run away from accountability. And it's accountability only is really self-reflection. It's going back
Yeah.
and saying, oh, what did I do? What did I get off on? Right?
I think we talked about it in our last episode, right? When we talked about goals. I mean, we
Right.
talked about this as
Yep,
well,
we
where
did.
we
Yeah.
talked about the importance of having community, working with
Hmm.
practitioners, and then also, yeah, being able to come and get help, get support when you are at that moment where things aren't working. And I talk to my patients about this every time. It's like, okay, so yes, we may do mind body medicine session. And in that, your beliefs, what you believe about yourself, and the behaviors that come out of your belief are the things that we identify so that we can change it. And so, what happens when the belief and the behaviors, we address it and then they're triggered? Some people are able to reinforce what the work that we did. Some people are having a harder time. It's like a pendulum swing where they go, it gets a little worse. And then it's like, okay, I made it through. Like, yes, I went to my initial habit. And then, okay, after I told you and we checked in, I was able to come to a place of balance. But the reality is, depending on how hard it is, so I ask people when they talk about the beliefs that they have from their experiences, if you believe that you cannot be healthy ever again, or you think that you're not going to be able to maintain control over your diet, if you continue to believe that and you really believe I have no control, if you are not able to come to a place where, or, that means we have more work to do, obviously. But if a person's not able to come to the place where they can buy in even a little bit, open up that window to, you know what, I do have control. The moment somebody's like, the light bulb, you know what, I do have control and I'm willing to believe that I have control, or I'm willing to let go of this idea. Just letting go of the idea opens up the possibility that, maybe, yes, I can have control over my diet, or yes, I can be healthy. And my behaviors that I'm choosing are going to reinforce this idea that I'm willing to work with, because everything that we do with healing, it really is about our willingness to be well. And to me, mindfulness is, yes, there's that aspect of being in, yes, we are in the moment. And in addition to being in the moment, I think there's a part of it where we are open to a possibility that anything is possible.
Yes.
And I feel
Absolutely.
like that's one of the things, like through meditation, that's what I've learned. It's like
Hmm.
I can try and control everything, but I know that I have no control. And meditation, yoga, a lot of the practices open up, allow us to be present enough for the possibility, the seed of possibility to be planted. And so for me, I agree, like when we're making the decisions, we should be looking at where we want to go. But sometimes that can be overwhelming to always make a decision based off of who we're trying to be, when in reality, we are who we are. There are aspects of our history that are always they're not always going to be with us, but they are with us. During different parts of our lives, there are different aspects of ourselves that are with us. And I think it's about holding space for that part too. And so, as people who are owning businesses, trying to create businesses that are successful and allow us to have the quality of life that we desire, I think a part of it is honoring, like you said, that aspect that may fail, because everything is a risk. Nothing is guaranteed. And, having a healthy relationship with failure, I think, is more important than anything else, just as you
Absolutely.
shared, because when we look at where people struggle the most, it's because they felt like it's like you fall off the bike, you fell off the horse, and you never got back on. And so the ability to get back on the bike, get back on the horse, open up your heart to a new relationship, all of those things, like, yes, those are the things that, like I said, through being present with ourselves and allowing the things that are always on the back burner, maybe the voices, whatever it is for people, the reminders that, you know what, in this moment, I'm just going to be open. I'm just going to be open. And I think if people can come to that place of being open and present, that is enough, because everything else tends to fall into place if we allow ourselves to be open, right? But I know that it's about that time for me. We're actually, so we switch times. Usually it's morning for me, it's evening for Joanna, but we switched and it's coming to late night for me and it's morning for Joanna. So it is coming to that time where we are going to continue this conversation, where we can deepen our relationship and our conversation around food as medicine, because, it's essential for our survival. Not just our survival, but our relationship to food can help us thrive. And I think that is the goal going into 2026. So Happy New Year.
Yes, Happy New Year, everyone. Yeah, we want to make sure that, that's for our clients, for our patients, there is the foundations of health that we kind of focus in on. Nutrition, fitness, stress management are kind of the things that individuals have to be able to grasp for their health and wellness. And of course, at times, we've talked about the therapeutic order on how you utilize all the different medicines for your health and wellness. And so we're here to empower the individual. And so we want to go further into this topic on food as medicine. And I love your talking of relationships and the mindfulness of relationships and beliefs in foods. And I think that is where we're headed. And the next episode is really building those new relationships with food and understanding and building those beliefs, because I know in working with older people from like the baby boomers and before, they had, for some reason, there was a shift in mindset that food did not play a role in health. And so I've seen it shift back, in the younger generations, but still understanding and grasping it in other relationships for food as medicine even more deeply can be very beneficial for you in being mindful and making those choices. So I look forward to our next conversation where we're going to dive a bit.
Yes, me too. Well, thank you for tuning in. And if you'd like to work with Joanna or myself one-on-one, you can definitely reach out to us. Our information is in the bio. You can click into our website so you can schedule directly on my calendar. And Joanna has her calendar and email available for people who are interested in working one-on-one. Thank you for tuning in. Happy New Year, everyone. And I hope that 2026 is a great year for us all. Thank you.